He handed me a mop in front of 8 people, and my own daughter said, "Stop pretending you're sick." The mop handle was damp from the kitchen sink, its fibers frayed and gray. I remember the scrape of linoleum under rubber soles, the flinch in my own fingers, the pearls catching the overhead light like witness marks. For a single breath I felt invisible, then ridiculous, then furious, an old woman being shooed into domestic theater by her son-in-law while the family watched, pretending not to notice how small the room had become around me. They were all there for a quiet Sunday dinner, casseroles, lemon chicken, my favorite red wine that I never drink these days, a salad arranged in a way that made it look as if someone had cared about presentation. Jennifer stood at the sink, face tight, fingers in the dishwater as if she could scrub the evening clean. Brad in his charcoal sweater, the man who still smelled of expensive aftershave and new cologne, smiled like a man who thinks charm can disinfect anything. He held the mop with a casual arrogance I wanted to slap off him. "You can help," he said, the words soft enough to be a joke, sharp enough to land like a hook. "Stop pretending you're sick." Everyone laughed a little, politely. There was that little rustle of silverware. An awkward fork clinked against porcelain. My mouth tasted like metal, and I realized my lips had formed a laugh that was not mine, a laugh to keep the room calm. I set the napkin on my lap and felt the satin of it like armor. Harold used to tease me about armor. He liked little jokes, the dry ones that made me tilt my head and laugh until my chest hurt. That laughter felt like a country I had once lived in. The mop moment is what people remember, if they remember any part of the story that followed. It is the photograph stuck in the album, the old woman, the mop, the daughter's hard-edged whisper. But photographs lie. They flatten time. Before that mop, there were months of humming under the surface, small things that could be written off as forgetfulness or stress. After the mop came a hard line, the realization that whatever comfort Harold and I had planned in our late years had been quietly dismantled by the one who had smiled over my dinner plate. If you're watching this, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, city, state, or country. I look for faces across miles. It keeps me from feeling like the only person who ever had a mop handed to her as if she were a prop. Harold died on an ordinary Tuesday in April. He had been sick in a way that had begun small and then folded the rest of our lives into it. I sat with him in the hospital, holding his hand the way you hold a rope when you're both clinging. There were moments of clarity, there always are, and he would squeeze my fingers, whisper about the backyard, about the wobbly step on the porch that needed a fix before the winter. He would call me Mags in a voice that sounded like our house on a Sunday morning. Then there were long silences, and a way of looking past me as if he were already seeing a room where I wasn't invited. We had been careful. Harold had been an accountant by trade and an investigator by temperament. He ran numbers the way some men ran errands, obsessively and with quiet joy. He taught me, in sitcom-sized lessons over tea, how to read a statement line by line. "Look for the pattern," he said. "Scammers love continuity. Anything that doesn't fit the rhythm, question it." He had a file we joked about, Harold's little black book, where he kept receipts, odd bills, things that didn't sit right. It was his way of keeping the world honest. When he died, the estate was sorted with a steadiness that felt like a kind hand in the dark. There was life insurance, investments that had been managed carefully over 37 years of marriage, and, more than anything else to me then, Harold's certainty that the life we had built together would continue in a shape that made sense. The number the lawyer read slowly in the first meeting was something I repeated like an incantation, because numbers are easier to hold than ghosts. $1.1 million. I heard the decimal point like a breath I had not expected to take. Jennifer was insistent that I come and live with them for a while. "You don't have to be alone," she said, the way women in her generation say things that are both offer and command. At first I resisted. My house had stairs and memories, and the creak of the kitchen door that had become my own metronome. then I thought of the evenings, the telephone in the hall that would ring and announce bad news like a bell. I thought of the quiet that carries its own danger. Finally, I agreed. Jennifer promised a guest wing, private space, the offer of company. She kissed my forehead like she had when she was small and brushed my hair away with a tenderness that felt like a rope back to safety. Brad slid into our lives like someone who had read the script and then made his own edits. He was charming on the surface, the right kind of compliments, the kind of attentiveness that makes a widow feel like a prize still worth claiming. He talked about adventures he would take me on, places he had connections to, an easy word for someone who traffics in everything from good intentions to lies. He loved to handle my jewelry the way other men pay attention to cars, asking about the little marks on my wedding band, the way the clasp had a chip from when we dropped it into the sink ages ago. He called me Gran in an affectionate voice in front of everyone, and Maggie when we were alone, as if the two names had different meanings, the way a salt shaker tastes different in a diner than in your own kitchen. It didn't start as fury. It started as annoyance, little things. Brad would forget to call when he'd promised, then text at odd hours asking about balances or surprisingly intimate details of our lives. He had a way with numbers that read like confidence. Once after dinner, he lingered by the kitchen table and asked casually about Harold's accounts. I told him, because I was naive and because Harold had taught me to be open about such things with family. Brad listened like a man taking in a market tip. He nodded, making soft noises that meant nothing and everything. I noticed an oddness in the way he referred to our finances, as if the pronoun had already migrated across boundaries. Jennifer would laugh and say, "Brad's just terrible at dates and numbers," and the laughter would settle like dust. I began to notice small withdrawals. Once, months later when Harold was gone, I started receiving calls from people, callers with hushed voices and grave manner, asking about investments and payments. I dismissed them, then felt the small prick of concern that has the shape of a splinter. Harold would have read the pattern and made notes. Instead, I found myself rereading ledgers at 2 a.m, the house speaking to me in the creaks he had left behind. The mop night happened 7 months after we'd moved in. It came after a day where the sun had felt mean for no reason, where a dent on the hood of my car had reminded me that things happen and people change them. The guests were friends of Jennifer's from her yoga class, young women who kept apologizing for the noise of their laughter, and Brad's clients, men who had a way of leaning back in chairs like they owned the air. There was a warmth in the room, the kind that makes people say the word cozy as if they are describing a photograph on a catalog page. I wore a blue dress my daughter loved, and pearls Harold had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. I remember the smells: lemon from the salad dressing, floral notes from someone's perfume, and beneath it all the faint machine-sweet scent of bleach, where Brad had been wiping counters as if he believed cleanliness could cover every friction. The mop slid into my hands like fate given a handle. My wrist pulsed with indignation. "What do you expect me to do with this?" I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. Someone chuckled. Someone else shifted. Jennifer's face leaned to one side. Anger and embarrassment pulsed in perfect tension. She said simply and quickly, "Stop pretending you're sick." I suppose I could have stormed out then. A younger woman might have. A different me might have rallied, called Harold's lawyer at once, demanded answers. Instead, I folded myself into observation. Shame can feel like a sleeping bear. It makes you small and keeps you from moving. So I stayed and I let the mop stand there between my hands and my life like a ridiculous scepter, and I catalogued everything in my head. Who laughed, how the light hit the table, the dull bruise of the word pretending. That night I sat by the window, pearls in a little dish where Brad had put them, and I watched the town go quiet. I thought about Harold teaching me how to read a bank statement. He would point to a number and say, "There's the story." Money, he insisted, tells its own truth. People like Brad were good at making news stories out of other people's truths. It took me days to stitch the mop into the seam of what had been happening. Once I connected the dots, I began to move like a creature waking up from a fog, careful, deliberate, and quietly furious. The first piece of evidence I took was not dramatic. It was an itemized bill, $230,000. The number seemed absurd on paper until I traced the transfer and saw the date, 3 months after Harold's memorial, listed as a loan to an account with Brad's name on the line, but an account number that routed elsewhere. The bank's customer service had been polite until they were not. "We can't disclose that without authorization," they told me in voices trained to be neutral. I had a stack of signatures, a copy of Harold's will, the name of the lawyer who had handled the estate. It felt like clumsy strength. I began to collect small truths in the same way Harold had always collected them, methodically. I installed a voice recorder, simple, a little device with a sticky pad, tucked under the cushion of my reading chair. I am not tech-savvy, but I know how to follow instructions. The trick, Harold taught me before he died, is to make your life slightly more difficult to spoil. Leave a breadcrumb in a place only grief knows to look. The recorder picked up the ordinary things first. Brad's laugh when he thought no one was listening, the clink of a glass against a plate, a phone buzzing like a locust. Then it captured language I wish it had not. "You know the old ones," I heard Brad say in one recording, a casual cruelty in the tone that made my palms go cold even now. "They don't look after themselves. They have assets. We just guide them. A little nudge here, a transfer there. They think they're doing it for us. We're their angels." He laughed then, a small, satisfied sound, and I pictured his hands smoothing through paperwork like a priest blessing documents. I saved every recording twice. I made paper copies of bank transfers, not trusting the digital world alone. I opened an account at a small credit union under my name and began moving funds there in increments Harold would have approved. Sensible, boring amounts that fly under the radar. I created a little fortress with ink and forms. I filmed the receipts with my phone, labeling them in folders, and then I wrote a note to myself in a shaky hand about how to access a safety deposit box we had once joked about getting. Harold, always practical, had a sealed envelope with our lawyer, his handwriting on the outside, simple and firm. I knew where that envelope was supposed to be in theory. In practice, it felt like a promise to be located after storms I was not sure would pass. When I finally opened Harold's file, after a morning of insisting, after plying the lawyer with coffee and patience, I found notes he had begun, the kind that are ordinary until they are not. He had written down names, numbers, a sequence of transactions. It was as if he had left a map with some parts folded and some parts annotated in his tidy, slanted handwriting. He had suspected something, I realized, and had not been able to finish the story. Instead, he had left me breadcrumbs in his razor-thin way. That same week, Brad's behavior grew bold enough to be called something worse than charm. He began to speak about our plans at the table, as if the pronoun had already been accepted by fate. Once, when Jennifer had gone to bed after a long day at work, he stayed up and combed through papers on the dining table like a man mapping a small heist. He left traces, a receipt for a wire transfer, an email open on the laptop that said, in part, investment growth potential, senior accounts, and a calendar event labeled Review Harold Assets. The calendar invite alarmed me more for its blandness than for its content. Criminals, I've learned, prefer the smell of banality. It camouflages greed. I began to press small questions into Jennifer like compass needles. She deflected at first. "Brad brought me security," she'd say. "He manages things. He does it so I don't have to." Love can be a shelter from seeing things clearly. The people you love protect you from the cold by holding you close and, sometimes, by dimming the light on obvious things. Once, when I asked her why there was a withdrawal for a contractor none of us had hired, she sighed and changed the subject. I watched her like a daughter watches her mother with binoculars she has not learned to use yet. There was one night I'll never forget, which began with the hiss of the tea kettle and ended with me sitting on the floor surrounded by paper like some old sad librarian. Brad was on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low and urgent, and the recorder under the cushion caught him saying the words that finally made the map line up. Why, he's got the insurance, the investments. The widow will be easy. Old women, nice for the evening, easier for the ledger. Move it to the shell company, then to the account overseas. I'll have it liquid by next quarter. The words hit me like cold water. I pressed the recorder's little button, then slid it into my purse like contraband. I traveled with it under my cardigan like a talisman. That night, I emptied drawers and found the telltale signs of a man who thinks only of his next mask, receipts from a hotel in a town 2 hours away, a few strange business cards, and an envelope with my name on it in a handwriting I did not recognize. The envelope contained nothing but a business card and a number. By the middle of that month, a pattern had emerged. Small transfers, late-night phone calls, Brad's movement outside work, a man I had married into my life as someone comfortable and now reshaped into someone predatory. I began capturing everything. I would ask simple questions and record the answers. When he bragged, because he always did, my little device was in my lap, making his hubris into evidence. I reached out to Harold's lawyer at last and asked about the sealed envelope. The lawyer was a man named Mr. Whitman, the kind of professional who had learned to keep his face even when the world around him crumpled. He opened the envelope with the reverence of someone handling a relic and read Harold's notes. He told me quietly that Harold had suspected irregularities, that he had put together a dossier and left instructions. Mr. Whitman suggested I take the copies to the local police before I did anything that might tip a predator's hand. He used the phrase, preserve the chain of custody, which is law speak for, don't let a fox know you found the hen house. I liked the phrase because it sounded like something Harold would say over tea. Detective Martinez is the first official person I talked to about the whole mess. He looked like he had been carved from the kind of patience towns need. Salt and pepper hair, hands that had probably shaken a lot of people's hands over the years, and a look that made you feel like the criminal might be more theatrically persuasive than dangerous. I brought him a folder the size of a small book, copies of bank statements, the $230,000 transfer highlighted in something aggressive and permanent, a USB with voice files, and a list of people I thought might be able to confirm what I was saying. Detective Martinez listened without blinking. That is one of those small mercies of the universe, when someone looks at you and really sees the lines of your story. I need to be frank, he said at the end of our first meeting. Financial crime against the elderly is tricky. They groom, they obfuscate. But you've done something important, documented a trail. We need to trace the accounts, see if he's got aliases, shell companies. This will take time. Time. The word hung between us like a weather report. I thought of the mop, of the way people had laughed. Time can be an accomplice if you leave cheaters unhurried. Martinez told me that sometimes these things escalate when the predator feels exposed. They panic, he said, or they vanish. He looked at me in that way men in his profession have that says gently, "This is not yet solved." He added he would reach out to the state's financial crimes unit. I went home feeling both relieved, someone had heard, and terrified. Time is a dangerous thread if you cannot pull it in the way you want. The next morning I packed a small bag. I do not travel light. I packed the pearls in a cardigan, 2 dresses, Harold's old watch, which I sleepily insisted on wearing sometimes like a small talisman, and the folder with extra copies of everything. I left a note on the kitchen table. Going to stay with Mrs. Crane for the night. Don't call. It was a small thing, but telling Brad not to call felt like drawing a line. Leaving the house that day felt less like running, and more like stepping into a plan. At dawn I drove away with the engine as a pulse beneath me, and the town receding like a painting sliding off a wall. My hands felt strangely steady on the wheel. In the motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the hum of the air conditioner and the newness of my own breath. I had a coffee from the vending machine and a packet of sugar in my pocket. Outside the window was a strip mall and the pale light of morning, which made the room look honest. Brad called twice while I packed, his voice on the second ring a mixture of concern and something that wanted to measure me. "Jen's worried," he said. "Come home. We can talk this through." I let it ring to voicemail. Then I texted Jennifer. "I'm at the motel. I'm okay. Call me when you can." She called quickly, the line thin with emotions she could not render cleanly into words. "Mom," she said. Her voice was bright with a stress that sounded like someone who has been holding her breath for a long time. "You left. Should I—" "Stay where you are," I said. "Tell me if he asks you to transfer anything. Tell me if he says anything about jewelry or the house." "He hasn't said—" she began, then faltered. I could hear her sitting on the edge of the bed in her apartment, the sound of the city outside. "Promise me you'll not agree to anything tonight," I said. "No signatures, no transfers, nothing from any number you don't recognize." I gave her directions, small and precise, the kind Harold would have appreciated. We ended the call, and I sat with the little recorder like a child with a secret. In the motel bathroom, I checked the lock on the door 3 times and took a long look at myself in the mirror. I saw a woman with Harold's eyes and my mother's jaw. There was history, and there was now. The mop sat in the back of my head like a bruise, an image I could use as weather for the storm. By afternoon, Detective Martinez had called back. He asked me to bring the originals to the station. "We'll make copies, start the tracing," he said. "We might refer this to federal partners if it looks like a pattern." The mention of federal partners made my pulse quicken in a way I did not like and did not entirely trust. It meant the problem might be bigger than one house. I drove to the police station and handed over the folder again. The desk sergeant took everything with a steadiness I had not known I needed. Martinez ran his hand over the top of the USB, palming it like something fragile and dangerous. "We're going to need you to come down to the station for a formal statement," he said, "and to testify to what you've recorded. We'll handle subpoenas for account records. Don't share these files with anyone else. They could compromise the case." His words made me feel both protected and terrified. The idea of testifying made my stomach twist in a way that made me think of small children at recitals, bare feet, bright lights, vulnerable in the glare of other people's expectations. But I walked out of the station with more than I had come with, a sense that the mop was no longer a photograph, but evidence of a wound I could dress. That night, Brad sent a text that began with tenderness and slid into something I could hear as a threat. "Mom, you're scaring Jen," it said. "This is going to hurt everyone. Let's keep this family thing private." The word private on his phone screen felt like a threat camouflaged in a request. I thought of Harold's notes and the $230,000 and the business card in the envelope. I thought of the way he had spoken about old women and liquid accounts. I sat in the motel bed with the recorder beside me and answered with a simple message. "I have already spoken to Detective Martinez." The reply was immediate and cold in its civility. "You're making a mistake," Brad wrote. "For all of us." I felt the motel room tilt for a second, the way a house tilts under an earthquake. For the first time since I had left the house, I felt the old fear in me, a small, sharp thing that lives like a jewel in the chest. But fear had a new company now: preparation. I had copies, recordings, and Harold's sealed envelope. I had a detective who listened with a steady face, and at the end of it all, underneath the mop and the humiliation and the knack of people to look away when something ugly happens, I had a resolve that felt like a muscle being remembered. The next morning I drove to the credit union and sat across from a young teller with a sincere face and an old-fashioned name tag. I withdrew enough to cover bills and moved a number into an account with 2 signatures required. The clerk looked at my ID with a professional suspicion, the kind I appreciated. Each small thing, each form filled in, each phone call to a lawyer, felt like lowering a plank into the river to build a bridge across the danger. I called Uncle Robert then. He is Harold's cousin, retired from the FBI, the sort of man who has held coffee with senators and sliders of potential danger across his desk. Uncle Robert's voice is a gravel road. He says things that are blunt and useful. I told him what I knew, and he did not say, "Leave it to me." He said instead, "Don't go back alone. If he's this bold, he'll try to control by humiliation first. That gives him the upper hand. You need to keep the upper hand." "How do I get the upper hand?" I asked him. And I say that to you now to show you that courage is sometimes asking for the map when you feel lost. "Keep doing what you're doing," he answered. "Document, leave a paper trail, and keep your phone on." Then he asked quietly for the phone number of Detective Martinez. He said he'd make a few calls, nothing that would tip anyone off, just to make sure that if things spilled into stronger danger, there would be adults in the room to handle it. After that call, I felt steadier. I went back to the motel, packed again, and drove to Jennifer's apartment. I did not go inside. I sat in the car and watched the building through the windshield. Jennifer left for work with a hurry in her step and a face drained of sleep. Brad kissed her that morning like a man who believed he had already rewritten the script. He took their dog, Whimsy, for a walk and left his phone on the kitchen counter. The phone buzzed with messages I did not open. He closed the door, and the sound of it was a small lock closing on a world I was about to investigate. Inside, as I sat at the kitchen table, I pulled the recorder from my purse and clicked through the files. Brad's voice came out of it like a memory in someone else's house, clearer and crueler than I liked. Jennifer called me at noon and said, breathless, that the bank had wanted to speak to her about some transfers. She sounded frightened in the way that people who love someone but are not yet willing to cut the cord into a clean shape become. I told her to stay put and to not do anything alone. When the voicemail came from an unknown number that evening, my heart ran small. It was a recording of a robotic woman. "This is an automated call regarding your account." The message insisted on me calling a number to verify recent activity. I recognized the pattern from Harold's little lessons. Scams mimic authority. I did not call back. I saved the message instead, adding it to the folder like a moth pinned to cork. The mop lingered in my mind like a weather report. Someone had handed it to me to make me clean up instead of handing teeth to the problem. My humiliation had become a kind of compass. I knew then that the story would not be over because I had felt small. I had to make myself an author again, one who writes the ending rather than having it written on her behalf. Detective Martinez called late that week. He had traced parts of the $230,000 transfer to an account that folded through a shell company, then to a firm with links in another state. "There's a pattern," he said, and I felt my hands steady because patterns mean stories and stories can be followed. He asked that I keep my phone on and not go back to the house alone. He said the word referral in that clinical voice, and I knew what that meant. This was moving beyond small-town Inc. and into a place where the federal government had eyes. "They may open a case," he said. "If they do, we'll coordinate. For now, don't confront him. Don't let anyone see what you have." My mouth had the taste of old pennies. Confrontation was tempting in the way of all visceral things, but Harold had taught me patience and the power of ink. I kept the recordings, the copies, the safety deposit key that Mr. Whitman had shown me, and I waited like someone who knows what storm is coming and collects tall chairs and matches. One night, not long after, Brad came home drunk. He staggered in with a bottle wrapped in a napkin, words slurring into the carpet like spilled wine. Jennifer was in the kitchen, her shoulders tight, and an unlit cigarette between 2 fingers. The dog cowered in the hallway. He laughed as if the world were his to own. He came up behind me in a way that made my skin shiver and said quietly, "You're making a mess." I could have struck him. I could have thrown the pearls at his face. Instead, I smiled in a way I had not smiled for months. Small, precise, the smile of someone who has rearranged her furniture and is trying out a new view. "Just doing my part," I said. "Harold taught me well." He met my eyes for a second, and something flickered there. Anger, recognition, a calculation. Then he left, and the door shut like a verdict. That night I slept with the recorder under my pillow, ridiculous and sensible at once. I woke before dawn with the mop image in my head, but it felt different now. It was no longer only a bruise. It was a starting point, the first public sign that I would be pushed into a corner and would, by necessity, choose to stand. In the days that followed, I began to find traces of other people's losses. A woman at the grocery store noticed my pearls and told me, without intending to, out of some communal urge to warn, about a neighbor who had sold a house because an advisor convinced her it was the only way to avoid taxes. I listened and tucked the anecdote into a pocket of my mind, like a note in a book. Evidence, I learned, is often a communal thing. People speak in fragments, and the fragments make sense when someone collects them into a narrative. Uncle Robert called. "They might take on the case," he said. "The patterns you've described fit a larger playbook. Keep the receipts. Keep your phone on." I had Harold's handwriting, recordings of Brad talking about liquid accounts, a transfer of $230,000 labeled as a loan, and a string of small documents that made up an anatomy of a crime. I also had the mop and Jennifer's words ringing in my head. I had the law on one side and my own fear on the other. When the police asked me for a formal statement, I sat in a room where the walls were painted a color intended to be soothing and felt the weight of the facts unspool from my mouth. I told them about the mop. I told them about the $1.1 million Harold had left and the transfer of $230,000 to an account that did not belong to him. I gave them the recordings, the copies of bank statements, the business card from that envelope. I did not tell them everything I suspected, only what I could prove. Detective Martinez wrote as I spoke, each word becoming a stone laid in a path. As I walked out of that precinct, the air tasted like rain. There was a sense that I had started something official, that the mop photograph might be replaced by a dossier. But officialdom moves like an eddy, and predators move faster when they smell the pebble of discovery. My mother's instinct was an old animal inside me that said, "Keep moving, keep stepping." The story was no longer just about humiliation. It was about stopping a man who had turned comfort into weaponized access. The weeks after that were a blur of forms and phone calls and a private war with my patients. Brad began to sense the shift. His movements grew furtive. He installed a new app on his phone that made his presence like an invisible hand in rooms we shared. He took longer drives, for work. A package arrived addressed to him at odd hours. A false company. A man's name I did not recognize. I started to write down every call, every odd receipt, every name that felt like a stitch out of place. There were moments of ridiculous lightness. Jennifer and I went once to a small thrift shop and tried on hats like two women from a movie. We laughed until our faces hurt, and for a moment the mop was a distant, ridiculous prop. Those moments saved me. They were proof that life could still wedge itself between the cracks of danger. But the danger had not slept. One evening, Detective Martinez called and asked me to come into the station. There were two men in suits I had not met before, one with a badge that said FBI and a woman who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Chen. Her voice was precise and direct, like someone who had been trained to pare sentences down to what mattered. When she shook my hand, it felt like the touch of someone who was used to turning stories into cases. "We're opening a preliminary inquiry," she said without drawing breath. "Your folder had an interesting pattern, Mrs. Collins. We'd like to coordinate with local partners." The presence of the FBI made my stomach churn in ways I had not expected. It meant the problem might be larger than a single house. It also meant more men and women in uniforms and more careful steps. Someone like Brad does not always act alone. At the mention of that possibility, a small, bright thing in me, practical and stubborn in equal parts, flared. If there was a pattern, we would have names. If there were names, we could follow them. Agent Chen spoke in a way that made law feel like a ladder built from words. "We'll need the originals," she said. "We'll execute subpoenas for the accounts and follow the money. For now, we advise you not to confront him or tell him you've spoken to us. That puts him on notice." I wanted to nod and scream at the same time. I stood instead and handed over another copy of the folder. Inside there was also Harold's sealed envelope, a paper promise he had left tied with a hope that someone would find it and read it. Mr. Whitman had given me a copy, telling me gentleness and bluntness wear the same shoe when you're handling grief. Agent Chen looked at the recordings. "This is valuable," she said. "Your recorder helped a lot. Keep it on, Mrs. Collins. Keep your phone close." She left with a calm that felt like a tide shift. The FBI's interest filled me with something I did not have words for. Then, relief, certainly, and terror in equal measure. I had crossed a line from being a lonely widow with a mop shoved into her hands to being someone whose small, stubborn acts might change the course of a predator's reach. That night, I sat in the dim of Jennifer's living room and bunched the blanket around my knees like an anchor. I thought about the mop. I thought about the way Elizabethan tragedies end, with people collapsing into the sense that they have been fools, but sometimes also with a slow, bright victory. I began to feel a hope that was not naive. It was a hope that came from doing the work of collecting truth. Harold had taught me to read numbers and see patterns. I had followed those lessons like a compass. On the dresser, where the pearls lay in a little velvet box, there was a business card I had pinned between pages of an accounting ledger. It was a small thing with a logo that looked vaguely reputable. On the back, a number. I photographed it and sent the image to Martinez and to Agent Chen, a breadcrumb on a digital trail. The mop was still in the script. Jonathan, a neighbor who had come by to drop off a casserole after Harold's funeral, mentioned at one point, softly, "That Brad, he's always been too smooth." My ears pricked each time someone mentioned anything like that. Each voice became a string in the net I was weaving. I did not know then what would happen next. I only knew that each small thing I did, each recording saved twice, each paper copy lodged in the safe deposit, each phone call to a politician, each quiet conversation with a detective, was a stitch in a fabric that might protect Jennifer and me. The mop had been a moment of public shame. The papers and recordings were the private countermeasure that would, if the world turned kindly, become the first evidence of a life recalibrated. When I looked at the clock that night, it read 2:17 a.m. I thought of Harold, of the old accounting lessons, and of his way of saying, "Find the pattern." I set the recorder on the nightstand, now filled with files and a copy of Harold's will, and I slid into sleep with a readiness I had not known I possessed. I woke to a text from Jennifer at dawn. It was 3 words that made the blood in my veins begin to race. "Brad's gone." The message had no punctuation, and I read it a dozen times before my brain supplied the meaning. Gone where? Had he called? Had he packed? The phone buzzed in my hand again, and the voicemail light blinked like a small emergency beacon. I pressed play and heard Jennifer's voice, breathless and thin, a tremor that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Mom," she said, and there was a sound under the word like someone moving furniture. "He says we have to go. He says we have to get away for a few days. He's packing the car. He says we can clear everything up." The recorder stuttered for a second with the edge of a sob. "I don't want to go," she whispered. "He's asking me to come. Mom, what do I do?" Her voicemail ended with the click of a door, and a breath that sounded very brave for someone who was afraid. For a second, my mind filled with the small domestic noises of the house, the kettle clicking off, a dog's paws on the tile, Brad's shoes left beside the back door. Then the obvious thing bloomed in me like a bruise. Brad had gone, and Jennifer had gone with him, or under him, or into whatever version of safety he could invent at that hour. I called Detective Martinez before my hands could remember being polite. He answered on the second ring, voice that morning edged with the kind of quiet that suggests a long watch. I told him everything in the minutes that had lived in the recorder and in my wallet, and I told him the voicemail I'd just listened to. He told me to sit down. He told me he would call me back. While I waited, I packed with an efficiency I did not know I possessed. The motel bed still smelled faintly of someone else's soap. I pulled on a cardigan Harold had liked and tucked the folder into my handbag like a refugee carrying a small, necessary book. I called Uncle Robert, and he was already moving. "Don't go alone," he said, as if that were the only order that mattered. "Bring the recorder. Control the impulse to be the hero by yourself." "When will the FBI get involved?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the motel room. "We've got Agent Chen making early moves," he said. "We trace the phone. They'll ping it. Don't confront him. Keep your line to Martinez open. If they can put the task force together sooner rather than later, they will." The hours moved with a sick, beautiful speed. Martinez called back. Brief, clipped. He told me they'd traced movement to an area that pinged at irregular intervals. The phone had flickered across cell towers, and the signal had settled in a stretch of country, with sloped fields and a few towns tucked like afterthoughts into the hills of West Virginia. "There's a property under one of his known aliases," he said. "It's remote. A cabin. We're working the warrants." Hearing it said aloud shifted something inside me. It was an action word replacing a threat. Remote, dangerous, too long a drive from any hurried help. This was everything that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and the muscle in my jaw clench. I thought of the mop in my hand, the way it had been used as a joke to make me small. For the first time in a long while, that public humiliation began to feel like fuel. Agent Chen called the next day with a voice that made plans feel like bridges you could walk. "We've got an investigative lead on a property bought under an alias Brad uses," she said. "There are indications he's moved items out of state. We're coordinating with local sheriffs and with a tactical team. We need a location for you to be reachable, somewhere safe. We'd rather you not be the one confronting him. That's the honest truth, Mrs. Collins." I wanted to tell her I had the recorder, the copies, the safety deposit key, everything I could feed them, but she already knew. Her questions were exacting in a way that felt like a doctor taking a temperature. "Do you have any reason to believe he would harm you or Jennifer?" she asked. "Any history of threats?" "He's humiliating us," I said. "He's corrupting money. He's violent with words. I have recordings where he talks about liquidating assets and taking care of the elderly. I heard him admit moving funds. He's not shy about that. He could escalate." "Good," she said gently. "That's enough. We'll push for an emergency protective order and coordinate movement. The local team will do surveillance. If the property is a staging ground for destroying evidence, we'll need to be ready for explosives and for a fast move. Don't try to be a hero, Mrs. Collins. We'll brief you as often as we can." There it was, the word explosives. My stomach went hollow. I thought of the small things I'd seen, odd purchases, the neat way Brad had hidden things in drawers. And then I thought of the shovel and the damp smell of old wood in cabins I'd visited as a girl. The world had a new edge. Harold's lessons, find the pattern, had led me here. It was time to trust the people who knew how to close the net. Uncle Robert arrived in a cloud of purpose and cigarettes on the first afternoon of the operation. He looked the way a retiree from an agency does, less polished, more useful. "They'll run clearance," he said. "We're not a film set. FBI won't move unless we're sure, but I don't like him alone in a cabin with anyone he can manipulate. He hugged me, and the hug felt like a plan being put in place by another, older hand. The team assembled like something from one of those programs on television you watch only to remind yourself that life is messier than fiction. There were men and women with boots that made loud announcements on gravel, tactical vests that folded like armor, and a truck with tools that smelled of oil and ozone. Agent Chen introduced herself again in person. Detective Martinez kept a steady presence like an anchor. They had traced a purchase, a cabin bought under a plausible corporate name, and then refinanced in a way that mirrored patterns the task force had seen before. Shell company, forwarding addresses, a chain meant to hide a man who liked to reinvent himself. We moved at night. The drive to West Virginia was a ribbon of light and dark. I watched the road through blurred windows and felt tiny beside the movement. My hands held the recorder like something that could sit on a table and make secrets speak. Uncle Robert sat beside me and told me small, practical things. How to keep from looking scared, how to breathe so your voice wouldn't shake if you had to speak in a room under bright lights. "You're not alone," he said. "You couldn't have picked a better ridiculous obsession than truth." When we reached the county line, the landscape changed. Trees bowed toward the pavement, and the smell of wet earth pressed at the car windows. The cabin was farther back than the map suggested, tucked off a lane that had long given up being maintained. It looked at first glance like a postcard from someone's regret. A porch sagging a little, paint faded to a color you might call dignified if you were being generous. A line of stacked wood that smelled faintly of smoke. The vehicle had a small sign. No shimmering lights, no banners, just a place that had been made private. From the Shell Company documents I'd seen, from the calendar entries in my own files, from the strange hotel receipts, everyone drew a pattern that led to a clearing with the cabin at its heart. The tactical team took positions at the tree line like actors on a stage where the drama had been written by someone else. Agent Chen asked me to stay in the vehicle at first, and my mouth said yes in the way that ears say yes when the brain is doing the worrying. We watched. The night was a prickly thing, the kind that keeps you alert. Men whispered into radios, the words a language I did not speak. Martinez came back to the car and put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt as if he were passing me a small, necessary steadiness. "We're going in," he said. "We have reason to believe she's there. We believe there may be staging to destroy records. Be ready to be a witness, but we need you to be a witness safe." Safe is an elastic word. I thought of the mop again. How small a thing could turn someone into a stage prop. "If I have to speak to him, can I?" I asked. "If there's a way I can stop him without making things worse?" "Stay behind the line," he said. "If you go in under our terms. We'll place you in a position where you can be present, but not endangered unnecessarily. We want you unharmed, Mrs. Collins." The team moved like a tide. They flanked the cabin with a precision that made my chest ache with a mixture of awe and fear. There was a motion at a window. A light flicked on. A car door closed across the clearing, and then someone moving fast, a figure at the porch. A voice, sharp with command, cut through the trees. "FBI, law enforcement, come out with your hands where we can see them." For a dizzy second, I thought I saw Brad's silhouette. Tall, lean, in a way that had once looked confident and now looked thinner, wound tight like a string. Then there was movement, a flash of motion as someone near the back stepped out. The dog barked once, a sharp, terrified sound, and then there was the smell. Smoke, not yet engulfing, but with the layered aroma of something burning slowly. Brad was there, and he was on the porch, and he looked at us with a thing that was almost anger, almost fear. His mouth moved, and I heard his voice on the wind, a practiced venom. You can't decide what happens in my life. I remember the tactical officer's cough of warning. "We have to make a perimeter." Agent Chen shouted. There was a plan being executed that I only partially understood: to contain, to prevent escape, to secure the people inside. Someone at the clearing's edge shouted again. The dog, Whimsy, ran between the legs of men and women and then ducked back under the porch like a small apology. Then the impossible happened. A small bright flash from inside the cabin and a blast of heat that smelled of diesel and metal. The porch sagged in a way that made the wood scream and throw up a sound like tearing fabric. Splinters spat, and the air filled with smoke so quickly it felt as if the day had turned inside out. Someone cursed, the kind of word you say when you cannot think otherwise. And then there were motions of people moving urgently toward the back of the structure. "Oxygen-fed accelerant!" shouted a voice I knew to be the explosives technician. "Possible secondary devices. Get back!" The team reeled. The plan changed into a scramble that was still artful and trained. The tactical leader called for distance and swept with infrared to check for motion. I could see shapes moving under smoke, a man staggering. Could it be Brad? And then disappearing. The cabin's windows bloomed orange. The smell of charred wood hit me, and I tried to breathe through it like something medicinal. "Did he set the place to burn?" I asked, my voice thin. "He may have," Uncle Robert said grimly at my elbow. "If he wanted to destroy evidence, this is a tidy way to go about it. If he wanted to harm someone, it's a way to force them into the open." A young agent came back with a face I will not forget, blackened at the edges, eyes wide. "Basement. There's an access," she said. "A hole with smoke coming out. We think he's moved things below ground. Possible explosives set with pressure triggers. We need containment." The team adapted with the slight, terrifying grace of people who have practiced saving lives. A sharpshooter took a position that had a line of sight unobstructed by trees. K-9 units were held back until the risk of detonation could be minimized. A plan formed that felt like the outline of a rescue. Draw him out, secure the perimeter, prevent the explosives from being triggered. By then, my hands were sticky with the sweat of fear. I had the recorder like a talisman and a life savings folder in my bag, and a jolt of something that felt like responsibility in my chest. Agent Chen pulled me aside and asked if I'd be willing to speak to Brad over a speaker mic if it could help. "We might be able to get him to expose himself," she said. "Your voice, if he trusts it, could draw him out and make it safer for us to isolate him." My mouth said the words I had whispered to the moon in motel rooms. "If it helps get Jennifer home," I said, "I'll do it." They set me up a few yards away with a microphone that hummed faintly, a wire running like a small, obedient snake back to the command truck. They placed me so I could see the porch and the tangle of smoke. My heart felt like something that had learned to walk faster at the sight of a threat. Behind my voice, men and women did calculations I could not hear. I adjusted my cardigan and felt Harold's watch cold against my wrist. I called, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Brad," I said into the open air, "it's Maggie." There was a pause filled with the kind of air you only notice when someone else is holding their breath. Then a rough voice answered, the sort of voice made brittle by panic. "Maggie," he said, "don't come any closer. It's not what you think." "It's never what I think," I said. "Where's Jennifer?" There was a rustle. I could hear someone move near a back door, and then Brad's voice again, lower and slippery. "She's with me. She wanted to come. She's okay. You don't need to do anything. You don't understand," he added, and then went on with a string of words that were mostly a performance. Fear, manipulation, naked greed wrapped in pseudo-protection. He spoke of starting over, of erasing debt, of protecting Jennifer from the mess he'd made. He lied the way thieves do, smoothly, as if reshaping the world into things they can profit from. "Let her go," I said. My voice felt like someone banging on a door with a spoon. "This is not how you fix anything." He cursed. There was a sound of something heavy thrown against a surface. Then a smaller voice, Jennifer, sounding thin and worn. "Mom," she said, and I could hear she was near him, perhaps in a room off the main hall, the way someone hides in a closet, but cannot hide the sound of fear. "Mom, I'm okay. He says he can explain." There were minutes that feel like whole lives when you are waiting. The sharpshooter got a bead on a silhouette as it moved at a window. An agent on the perimeter called out instructions in a voice that did not rise in panic. The plan was to lure Brad outside under the pretense he was needed to move Jennifer to safety and to prevent him from triggering anything inside. Then the worst, brightest sound, a secondary blast below, a concussive thump that set sperm into my bones. Debris flew, the soil heaved, the cabin lurched. Someone shouted about a tunnel. Basement tunnel, pressure-triggered devices. And I felt something like a stone drop in the middle of the operation. They were not just trying to burn a house or destroy documents. They had rigged something below ground that could collapse and kill if mishandled. The things I'd suspected, burning evidence, quick escape routes, coalesced into a plan that could have been lethal. "Get everyone back," Martinez shouted. "We need to detonate in a controlled manner if necessary. Check the perimeters. Are there booby traps on the exit points?" The technologist ran a scanner and reported back with the precise, terrifying vocabulary of an expert. "There are wired charges in the tunnel," he said into his radio. "Pressure plates, likely secondary triggers. We can't move too quick without remote procedures." I thought of Harold's gentle hands folding a newspaper, and the way he would point at a number and squint into it. I thought of every small document I had saved. I thought of Jennifer's voice on the mic and the dog barking at my feet. The team made a decision that balanced danger and rush with law. They would isolate the cabin, use an explosive ordnance disposal unit to neutralize what they could, and attempt to get Jennifer out safely. It was a terrible geometry. Advance too fast and risk detonation. Wait too long and risk the structure collapsing and hurting someone inside. Then a sound I will never forget. A shot. Not a random shot, but a precise one. The sharpshooter had hit Brad in a leg, a wound that made him drop a metal object he'd been holding. He went down with a curse that sounded smaller than it should have. The team moved as rehearsed. They had closed a plan to force him out of the main line of sight, to prevent him from setting off anything else in panic. They dragged him out. There was blood on the edge of his sleeve and hate on his face, and the handcuffs that clicked on him later had a sound like the end of a story. Jennifer stumbled into the arms of agents, and I heard her breathe for the first time without the tremble that had been under every word she'd been saying. She was covered in ash, her hair smelled of smoke, and she was thin with fear, as if a few weeks of careful deception can make a grown woman look like a child. They took Brad away, and he cursed and he spat, and he said things that would become evidence in a courtroom. He said my name in a way that aimed to shame, but by then his hand was cuffed, and something of him was already undone. The team checked the tunnel and found, as they had feared, layers of wiring and a small cache of incendiary materials that would have made the place impossible to search safely a mere half-hour longer. There were devices that would have demolished evidence, and possibly the cabin itself, and given him a chance to disappear if the wind had been right, and the right portion of the earth had given way. That night, when the fire had been controlled and the teams had done the delicate work of making the site safe, Agent Chen sat with me in a mobile command tent and offered me coffee that had been reheated for hours. Her face, though professional, had an expression I'd seen before on men at vigils, soft as if the world had made a small pause. "You were calm," she said. "You did more than you could imagine." "I was terrified," I said. "Every second." "That's normal," she said. "You did the right thing by letting us handle the dangerous parts. Your recordings were pivotal. Brad's patterns were exactly what you described. He had planned for the burn and the tunnel to destroy financial records, and, it looks like, to buy him time." Uncle Robert brought me a blanket, and I felt a small childish urge to cry. Instead, I kept my hands busy, folding the edges of the blanket as if making curtains for something fragile inside. Jennifer sat nearby, wrapped in a thermal blanket and shaking as if from cold or from the aftershocks of fear. She looked at me and then away, at the men and the radios and the smoldering porch. The look on her face was a mixture of shame and the slow, half-formed admiration people sometimes have for those who saved them. The arrest did not feel like full closure. Arrests rarely do. But it was a hinge. Brad would not be able to vanish into a new alias while his devices turned ash. The evidence in the tunnel and the recordings that had captured his speech would be threads the prosecutors could follow like a trusted map. Later, at the hospital, they bandaged his leg. He glared at me with a rage that was small, misfiring. The agents found ledgers, phone numbers, fake business cards, and the name of a bank in a different state with accounts that bore a suspicious pattern. Each thing tied another loose end from the folder I'd left in a motel to a story that suddenly had the concrete of dates and transfers. The team assembled warrants and the task force moved, and I felt that same odd pull of gratitude and fear for the institutions that suddenly towered around me. The trial moved over months, like a ship that never knows quite how big the storm will be. Brad's arraignment set the tone, charges for elder financial exploitation, for the transfers that had siphoned money, and for the attempted destruction of evidence and the dangerous devices discovered in the tunnel. He pled in various ways, angry, defiant, contrite at times that felt manufactured. The prosecution brought tapes. They brought bank records that made the $230,000 transfer look like a sign on a wall. They brought testimony from other victims whose names had already shown up as patterns in Brad's prior entanglements, faces that peered from the crowd like a chorus of small, firm grievances. Uncle Robert sat with me in several hearings, his hand warm and steady. Agent Chen came to court and sat in the row behind us, and Detective Martinez brought the folder that had started everything. The courtroom was a large room with the smell of polished wood and a gravity that gave every sentence a weight. The prosecutor painted a picture of someone who preyed on trust and then tried to burn the footprints. The defense offered a mosaic of denials and rationalizations. Brad, in the box, kept his head low and sometimes seemed asleep like a man rehearsing defeat. When the judge read the sentence, the room seemed to suspend itself in a single breath. The transcript will show the words, counting charges, reading the gravity of actions. But for me, it landed like a bell. 7 life sentences, the judge pronounced, a phrase that made the men in shirts around me exhale in ways that meant the law had weighed the cost and chosen to make a certain kind of impossible. That number, 7 life sentences, felt like a legal iron cast around someone who had nearly dissolved our history into ash. Restitution came slower and odder than vengeance. The prosecutors told me that sums would be pursued, assets traced, and some funds would be returned through civil suits and through seizure of property. It was a messy, bureaucratic, patient thing. Money never comes back as neatly as you imagine. But the records and the evidence allowed the recovery of a substantial portion of what had been taken in the transactions we'd been able to prove. I was not naive. I had never expected every cent to return, as if no theft had taken place. But there was money that came back, and a settlement that meant the smaller things, bills, investments, could be repaired in ways that felt honest. The aftermath reached beyond the courtroom. Jennifer and I had to sit with what she'd allowed and what had been done to her. She was not a monster for being loved into blindness. She was a person who had been deceived, manipulated, and groomed. Our reconciliation did not feel like a single act, but a series of awkward, necessary steps. There were long conversations in cheap diners, with coffee cooling between us. There were angry nights when words were thrown like silverware, and calmer afternoons when we tried on hats at thrift stores and laughed like 2 women practicing the parts of themselves that were undamaged. Therapy helped. We both sat in small rooms with people whose job was to untangle trust. There were sessions where she cried for weeks she hadn't had, and there were sessions where I learned to say no without apologizing. Margaret Collins, Maggie, who had once been given a mop at a dinner table, learned to see the mop as a turning point rather than a tombstone. The legal closure did not end my relationship with truth. I began to speak, slowly at first, to support groups and then to larger audiences. People reached out through email and through quiet messages in grocery aisles, the sort of human contact that lets you know a thing happened to more than you alone. I learned that showing people how to document, how to store records, how to keep copies, was a skill that could be taught without shame. I used Harold's old trick, look for the pattern, and taught it in community centers and in small church basements where people came with paper fans and the fierce desire not to be preyed upon again. We worked, too, on advocacy. Uncle Robert, with his connections and his dog-eared contacts, helped set up meetings that felt like small, urgent summits. Law enforcement, community organizers, bank compliance officers. We discussed policies that could make it harder for someone to move large sums on the sly, for banks to flag odd behavior, for senior financial counseling to be taken seriously. It was not glamorous. It was the sort of work that looks like repairing a fence after a storm. But it mattered. I found new rhythms in my life after the trial. Jennifer and I moved me into a small apartment that smelled like lemon and new paint. I bought a chair I could not afford neatly and paid it off with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with starting fresh. I planted herbs on a small balcony and learned how to coax basil into being generous. I traveled twice in the year after the sentencing, once to a coastal town where I walked beside the sea and listened to gulls like small auditorium applause, and once to a college campus where I spoke about elder financial abuse and sat with students who wanted to study law. The world seemed larger and softer in the edges. There were small, restorative rituals. I sold some jewelry, keeping only Harold's wedding band, which I wear on a chain. The pearls I kept only sometimes, for mornings when I wanted to remember that once I'd been regarded with tenderness. I started volunteering at a nonprofit that helped elders manage their finances, which felt like a small, circular act of justice. Teaching someone how to read a statement and recognize the rhythm that Harold had taught me felt like passing a small lamp into a room. Sometimes, when the news cycle turned to other tragedies, and my story receded into the glass of old coverage, I would sit on the balcony and feel both gratitude and a sadness that never quite left. I thought of the mop, a small, vivid thing which had been a public shame and then a private engine. It's a strange and odd commodity to take humiliation and turn it into resolve, but I had done it. I had learned to use paper and recordings the way some women learn to use a skillet, something practical, hard, and capable of defense. At times, friends asked if I regretted staying in the house early on, or if I had done things differently, would the pain have been less? My answer was always the same. Grief and hindsight are tidy until you live them. If we had done anything earlier, would it have made a difference? Perhaps. But every small slowness, my hesitation, my love for Jennifer, my loyalty to Harold's memory, had built the patience that allowed us to catch the pattern and to hold it up like a net before everything unraveled. The court ordered restitution, and the headlines in town were a sketch of what had happened. The 7 life sentences, the seam of the tunnel, the burns on a porch, these things were facts now, not only in the file but in the way people looked at Jennifer and me in the supermarket. Some looked with pity, some with reverence, many looked away. I learned to accept a range of gazes and to keep my own steady. The days of mop jokes ceased pretty quickly. Occasionally, someone would bring it up in a way that made my teeth ache, as if the moment was only a punchline. I learned to tell the story as a narrative with sharp edges and lessons, not a lament for what happened, but a manual for what to do when it might happen to someone else. People sent me messages, some apologetic for not seeing earlier, some furious on our behalf, and some quietly grateful for the instructions I shared. Jennifer and I rebuilt. There were ceremonies, small ones, that meant the world. A dinner where we both cooked and where the mop was nowhere in sight. A small trip to a sunflower field where we laughed and took pictures that did not feel staged. She decided to take a class at the local college and came home buzzing with the idea of becoming a counselor for people in abusive financial situations. I started a small community group called Patterns and Proof, where we taught people how to document, how to store copies, how to use a safety deposit box. We partnered with banks who agreed to flag patterns, and with local police who promised to treat calls seriously. Sometimes friends asked me how I felt about Brad's sentence. The truth is complicated. For a long time, I had wanted him stopped. I wanted the money returned where it could, and I wanted Jennifer to feel safe. The 7 life sentences were a legal closure. Restitution brought back some of the losses. But the deeper thing, trust, safety, the sense of being whole, has to be rebuilt, moment by moment. The justice system delivered something useful and necessary. The rest was up to us. Uncle Robert passed 2 winters later. He died quietly with his dog at his feet and a smile that suggested he still thought the world could be fixed if you found the right lever. At his service, people spoke of his practical kindness. I thought of how he had taught me to think like a planner and how his straight voice had steadied me when the world blurred. I put his old tie in a drawer and felt grateful for the small, sturdy shelters we had made together. There are nights when I still wake and see the mop in my hand and feel a small, old shame. But now the shame has a companion, the knowledge that I can build a house of papers that will not be burned easily. I keep Harold's ledger folded in a box that sits beneath the bed. I check bank statements each month with a ritual that feels like prayer. I keep my phone charged and my records scanned in the cloud and in a safety deposit box that has a key tucked into an envelope in the lawyer's safe. If someone asks me how to start, I tell them the small things. Record suspicious conversations, make multiple copies of documents, open a separate account with 2 signatures required if you can, talk to a lawyer, and, most importantly, don't let humiliation make you small. Shame makes predators brazen. Documentation makes them finite. The last time I saw Brad was through a series of legal motions and then never again. The sentence was pronounced, and the gallery dispersed, and the world moved on. Jennifer speaks of him less now, of that man who invented danger like a hobby and then tried to burn his tracks. We built something sturdier in pink slips, and talk therapy, and small cups of tea, and dreadful hours of paperwork. We learned to say no without apology. We found a new rhythm of laughter. Years after the cabin and the tunnels and the courtroom, I sat in a classroom as a guest speaker. A woman near the back raised her hand and asked quietly, "Did it hurt being handed that mop?" "Yes," I said. "It did. It was humiliating and small and public. But it gave me the vantage point I needed to see what was actually happening. It made me start collecting things I should have collected sooner. I turned humiliation into a plan." She nodded as if that sentence was a map. I told the room, plainly, about receipts and recordings and lawyers, and about the way law enforcement can be a ladder if you hold the rope steady for them. I taught them what Harold had taught me. Look for the pattern. The mop is now a story I tell sometimes with a laugh that no longer hides a bruise. I tell it because people need to hear that you can be shamed and still save your life. You can be older and still be strategic. You can be a widow and still be fierce. If this moved you, share your story in the comments and subscribe for more survivor stories.